So we've decided on our sampling rate and our bit width and how many channels we need to represent audio for a particular situation. Now, how do we figure out how much space it takes up? That's what we're going to cover in this video. We're going to look at how to calculate storage space, and then we're going to look at different file formats to use. Lossless file formats that preserve all of our amplitude values perfectly, and lossy file formats that can save us a lot of disk space, but lose some data in the process. So before we look at the file formats, let's just go through some very simple calculations here. Let's assume that we had 1 minute of audio at 16 bits, 44,100 hertz, and it's stereo, so 2 channels. How much disk space would this actually take up to store? So we've got 60 seconds. We've got 44,100 samples per second. And then we've got 16 bits per sample and 2 channels, 2 samples per moment in time. I'm not going to manually do all this math for you, but this comes out to about 84 million bits. Now, before you start freaking out, that's bits. That's not usually how we talk about digital data. So if we convert this to bytes, we divide by 8. And then if we wanted to go to kilobytes, we would divide by 1024. And then if we wanted to go to megabytes, we'd divide by 1024 again. And that number is going to end up coming out to be about 10 megabytes. So in order to store 1 minute of 16-bit, 44,100 hertz stereo sound, we need about 10 megabytes of disk space. So how are we going to store this? Let's assume we've got plenty of space to store it. That's not an issue. We just want to store it on disk. The easiest thing we can do is just use a standard file format that basically takes all the amplitude values, all their binary digits, and just kind of plops them onto disk in a structured format. And the 2 most popular formats for doing that these days are WAV files and AIFF files. There was a time long ago where WAV was kind of the Windows format and AIFF was the Apple format. In any music technology program we'd be encountering these days, they would all support both formats just as well. There's a lot of more obscure formats that aren't used nearly as much. These 2 are supported by just about every audio program out there. If we wanted to save some space, we could try to compress this data, and we could use a lossless compression format. What a lossless compression format would do is something similar to what like a zip archive would do for other types of files. It would go through and it would try to re-encode all these amplitude values in a way that represents the most commonly used ones a little bit more efficiently, at the expense of representing some of the less frequently used ones less efficiently. Using a technique like this, we could save usually about 50%. So instead of our 10 megabytes per minute of CD quality sound, we'd have about 5 megabytes to represent that same minute. And the most popular format here is FLAC. That stands for Free Lossless Audio Codec. There's others that you encounter from time to time. ALAC is Apple's. It's called Apple Lossless Audio Codec, but it's not very well supported by many other programs that aren't made by Apple or that don't use Apple's APIs for audio. They're tools for importing and exporting audio files. But this is something that's available. If you need to get that 2-to-1 savings in size because you're trying to email a file to someone or share it somewhere or whatever it might be, but you want to keep all those amplitude values perfectly intact, this can be a good technique. But what people usually wind up doing when they want to save space is they use a lossy file format. Lossy file format will compress the file size in a way that you can never get the original back. But it does it using a perceptual encoding strategy. In other words, it actually considers how we hear sound, psychoacoustics, just like we were talking about earlier in this module. And it thinks about what are the things that we're not going to miss so much in the sound? What are some frequencies that we can't hear that well, or particularly ones that might get kind of hidden or covered up by other audio content that's in the sound? And they try to use that to make intelligent decisions about what to leave out and what to keep in. And you've all heard, I'm sure, of some popular file formats in the lossy category. MP3 is the most popular. AAC is fairly popular as well. Ogg-Vorbis is another one that's used quite a bit. There's many, many others as well. These are three of the most popular ones. And they usually get you about a 90% savings over the original. So instead of 10 megabytes per minute of CD quality sound, 44,100 hertz, 16-bit stereo, we usually get about 1 megabyte per minute, depending on the exact savings. So that's a substantial savings, particularly useful in a lot of different scenarios in terms of how we consume music today. If you're on your cell phone and you're trying to stream a music track from a music provider, you can't necessarily stream a WAV file over your crappy old 3G connection or whatever connection you might have available, or you might not want to use your data plan up for all that streaming. So you can use a lossy file format, and here's something that's pretty good over your cell phone, but takes up only saves you 90% of your bandwidth. So it can be useful in a lot of situations like that. I do want to issue a very important warning here. It's a lossy format for a reason. You can never get the original back. And so if you're making your own music, it would be a horrible idea to only save it in a lossy format like an MP3 or an AAC or Ogg-Vorbis or something like that. Because let's say you then later wanted to go back and edit it or make some changes or re-encode it in another format. Well, you'd be doing all of that from a version that has lost some of the amplitude data over your original. Those amplitude values are not going to be the same as when you created them and recorded them. And so it's never going to sound quite as good as the original version that you created in a lossless format. And if you then go and try to re-encode it in a lossy format again, so it's a very common thing to say, take an MP3, decompress it into a waveform, do some editing on it, and then save it as an MP3 again. Well, now we've basically done two different MP3 compressions. The first one, when I saved it the first time, and now the second one after I've decoded it and edited it, and I'm saving it again. And that's going to compound the effects of the losses when I do that. So it's always a good idea when you're editing files, when you're working with them, when you're saving them, your own music for archival purposes, to save it in a lossless format like a WAV or an AIFF file, or even like a FLAC, free lossless audio codec, something that's going to help you get back the full quality of the original if you ever want to edit it or re-encode it again in the future. So in this video, we've talked briefly about how to calculate the storage space of audio data, digital audio data, based on decisions we've made about bit width and number of channels and sampling rate. We talked about ways to reduce that storage space through lossless file formats and lossy file formats and the implications of each. In the last two videos in this module, we're going to move on to something a little bit different, but it actually goes back to some of what we were talking about when we looked at timbre, which is essentially how do we create those frequency representations of sound that we were looking at when we talked about timbre, the sonogram and the spectral view.